survey kind of focusing on the issues around the ways in which non-profits work with artists and artists' experiences with working with non-profits in New York. So tonight we're going to present, Wage is going to present that survey, and then we'll lead into a kind of more specific kind of way of looking at artist spaces, recent history of working with artists and paying fees or not paying fees in certain situations, and talking a little bit further about that in relation to an example of a fee schedule from Canada, from CARFAC. So I'll hand straight over to Wage, and they'll go into a lot more detail about the presentation of the survey and the survey itself.
I'm Al Steiner, and thanks for everyone who's come to the second event. We did have an event that we had to postpone, a talk with Marian Von Osten and Andrew Ross, which we do hope to accomplish someday soon, still on our agenda. So thanks to Artist Space for keeping going with this project. Lise, AK, and I have been working in Wage since 2008. Alison Gerber is here, who is a sociologist and a PhD candidate at Yale, and is interested in, my page closed during the break. What was that your studies focus on?
My research focuses on value in working life.
Value in working life. I was trying to print that. Thought I would have known that by heart. So we're going to launch the discussion, well, the presentation, and then afterwards have a break, then have a discussion. There's free food provided by Feast over there, and Common Space, John's Feast is, well, the acronym stands for funding. It's going to be hard to get. My notes all closed. I'm just trying to open them. Feast Brooklyn, which hopefully someone here, David, could maybe.
Feast, can you stand up?
The acronym stands for?
The acronym is Funding Emerging Art with Sustainable Tactics, and we're basically doing a series of dinners and artist grants.
So they're dinners that fundraise, and then they allocate those funds for artist projects. So Feast Brooklyn is truly amazing, so we're glad to be partnering with them, and also Common Space, who designed what is 3 years, it doesn't look like 3 years, but 3 years of statistics, statisticians, and design partnership between many different people. But Common Space is the designers of that. And William Levita is also here, who has been at the other events, and we've been in partnership with him to produce that insert in the artist survey. So this survey will be online. We're going to post it on the Wage site and the Artist Space site, and it will be a downloadable PDF. So this is a special edition, extra special edition that we brought to you tonight that we're going to talk about shortly. Okay, so, right, well, first slide. That's Wage. So we're here to present a talk. Here we are presenting a talk. And we started in 2008, and we wrote what we call the One Manifesto, and then lots of things have happened since 2008, but our partnership began with Artist Space when we sent out our artist survey, which is why we're here tonight, and we were contacted by Artist Space to discuss this issue of artist payment further, and there's lots of details inherent in that conversation, but essentially that's why we're here tonight. So you can see on our website our One Manifesto. And this is the site where that Artist Space and Wage share on Artist Space site at the moment about the research partnership itself. It's described what it is, what we're hoping to accomplish, and one of those things was to release these survey results, which we're doing now, and then the other program to develop wage certification, which would be a self-regulatory set of standards, best practices standards, developed with an institution, and Artist Space and Wage decided that we would begin that partnership together and see where it led and how it could be implemented. So essentially we set up a dialogue in order to learn from each other, not to demand things from each other or to blame things, on each other, but to understand what this relationship is about, what it means to be a practicing artist, an exhibiting artist, a lecturer, a performer, an independent curator with an institution, not with a commercial gallery, with a nonprofit institution. And nonprofit, that's a whole other can of worms, but we'll get into that more. So, and you can chime in. So, and Allison we brought in, Allison, we all met at the various events that happened, and Allison spoke to us, and her perspective and work seemed really pertinent to how we can understand the classification of artists, what artists and institutions do, how they function in relationship to each other, and her work, sociology work, and her artwork has focused around these questions and ideas about classification. So here's the survey. That's once again our now famous survey as of today. And this is what we'll get into now, what happened within the scope of that survey. The survey was sent out, it was distributed through our website and eFlux and various people forwarding it, and a couple smaller groups forwarding it to each other around, and we essentially got about 1,000 respondents who completed the entire survey. There were other people who started it and didn't complete it. So from those statistics that were gathered and on SurveyMonkey, an online survey development site, we then hired a statistician to look at the results and to help us understand them, basically. Because we didn't really know exactly what we were getting into. Lise spearheaded the survey. She came to an open forum meeting that we held in Judson Church in 2009 or 2008, and approached us about how we could accomplish finding out what was happening between artists and institutions, what kind of payment practices were being explored, what standards were being followed. And so from that survey, it took us about a year, and it was finished when it was closed, no more respondents could answer. It took us a year to deal with the results, the statistics. So here we are today.
Okay. I just wanted to say that when we started the survey, the idea was that if we were going to start, potentially agitating about this issue, that we needed proof. We needed to understand whether people were getting paid or not. And there was some question about whether payment was mandated by funders. So whether in getting funding, not-for-profits were required to pay artist fees, and none of us really knew that. So that was another factor that was important in initiating the survey.
Okay, I'm going to walk us through the survey. This developed out of a lot of kvetching, and then realizing that we couldn't kvetch if we didn't really know what we were talking about. I mean, there's a lot of stories that go around. And so we wanted to get real numbers, let's say, to just have a sense of what's out there. I don't know. I just need this like move and I'm done the whole thing. I'm sorry, guys. All right, so the wage survey covers statistics about the economic experiences of visual and performing artists exhibiting in nonprofit arts organizations in New York City between 2005 and 2010. So we closed the survey, sort of started and closed the survey in 2010. And we wanted to do a kind of 5-year bracket to look at if time had anything to do with it. We've taken any time out of the actual stats that we're presenting here. So all of this is a culmination of those 5 years. Yeah.
We didn't ask about dates of exhibitions. It was just, did you exhibit?
Yeah, and it was an anonymous survey as well.
For the 5 boroughs.
And also specifically for the 5 boroughs of New York City. Okay? Oh, yeah. Also, there's seating up here. I know some people are standing in the back, just so you know, there's still a lot of stuff, there's seats up here. Okay, so one of the, what we're gonna start with was sort of how the survey started, which is just a really general question. Did you get any money? Did you, when you worked with an institution, was there any monetary exchange? And that being like somebody paid for your travel, some of your shipping was covered, maybe you got an artist fee, maybe you got an honorarium, which is what is commonly used in most institutions, which is just a sort of general fee that may cover some of something of what you do. So this is kind of like, did you get something or anything, or was there something financial that was an exchange?
Just for clarification,
Yes.
I mean, getting directly in hand, but getting indirectly too. I mean, like if you say shipment, is it
No.
reimbursed? So is it a cash transaction?
Expenses covered.
So did you get any form of payment, compensation, or reimbursement for your participation in the exhibition? So that would include shipping, like they might, you didn't receive the money inherently, but things were covered. Things were taken care of. So that's what, on some level, some money was exchanged.
Exchange?
Or not exchanged, I'm sorry, you're right. I'm using the wrong word. Yeah, something was paid for. I mean, this is the thing, is that I think that there's,
So just to summarize it, 58% of all not-for-profits within New York don't pay for anything related to artists or
No, it was, well, 50%, 58% of respondents did not receive any form of compensation.
So they
Including the
participated-
coverage of any
They
expenses.
participated completely out of pocket.
Yes, out of pocket, no fee, no expenses covered.
including shipment.
I think so, yeah, I mean, that was the question.
That's, yeah.
So that includes, I mean, the questions got more specific as the survey progressed, but that was this is sort of the the most, you know, sort of the broadest, most important statistic.
The arts have to be within the 5 boroughs and the exhibitions within the 5 boroughs?
oh, it was only 4 exhibitions in the 5 boroughs.
They didn't have to.
But we had respondents who were international, who like had shown, or national or international, who had shown in New York. It's just that we limited the list of institutions we offered to New York City. Just, you know, trying to cover the nation is a whole other. We're starting local.
But there was an other category, we're gonna get into that later, there were a lot of other organizations, and not all of them,
Only one of them.
yeah, but there were many that we did that we could never have included in the list because it was already extremely long. It's actually at the bottom of the poster, if you picked it up. We have the list of what was in the survey and what was other, so what people, the information that was supplied by the respondents.
Yeah. I don't know if this one's on. This one on? Yes? No? This is in response to Stefan. If you, when we get to the breakdown by institution, you'll see that there isn't a clear distinction between institutions that pay and institutions that don't pay. Each institution pays for some things in some cases, for some artists and not for others. And so there isn't any clear separation by institution.
Right, which is what we're going to see here. So these are institutions. We had to pull out any stats that really had less than 5 people working with it. Who responded to a particular institution. So if we only got 3 people responding to an institution, we just threw the institution out in terms of. So there's a full list, like I said, of institutions that were offered at the bottom, and then there is the list of institutions that are here, which are where we got 5, upwards of 25 respondents per institution. So mind you, these are all very, they're medium to small numbers for developing stats. So this is a very kind of temperature check of how things are operating. So Performa is on one end.
They're very small and hard to see on the screen, but
Yeah.
they're
That's
even.
why you have your printed version.
Right. But is there anything you need?
So this is, again, the same question that was for the last one, the yes or no question, but this is broken down by institution. So the kitchen came out shining on the far right here. with 100% of people saying they got some kind of coverage. Performa,
100%, that's, no, like. so
but that
not
just
being
means
negative,
the people in the
100%
survey.
means 100% of all.
It just means that everybody
the
who answered that
respondents.
question said that they received some form of payment. But
And
again,
it doesn't
Not
mean,
100% of 50, it's 500%.
no,
No,
because
that's
only
like-
certain people, a certain number of people
that's like
answered
10
that
people
question.
said 100% of the time, which is what I'm saying. So I'm framing every statistic here in the sense that there are 577 respondents gave us all of this data, and that's broken down here now by institutions, so there's smaller portions of that 577. Other thing to notice is other large museum, which is at the 44.4%, and other small and medium, which have asterisks, and again, you have to reference at the bottom of the poster. Those are categories where we allowed people to write in institutions that were not listed.
But then, and it's useful, because that gives you a sense that there were many other organizations that people listed, and it sort of ranks somewhere in the middle, which is,
Well,
I think, a useful thing to know.
Right, and one thing that's interesting about those two categories is we got the most stats on those, actually. We had the highest number, highest concentration. Once you start to just put a bunch of institutions together, then you just kind of get a sense of what's going on, which turns out to be similar to this 58 to 40, the 58% to 41% that you saw in the yes/no category.
Actually, just to add to that there were a lot of respondents for PS1 and Performa,
That's
which
true,
also
those were
tells you,
huge.
I think the conclusion to draw from that is just that many artists are showing with these organizations. Whatever that means. It means something.
does
Especially
mean something
in
in
relation to what they are or are not able to pay or are not actually paying.
We're moving on. So this is broken down by the size of exhibition. So if you were in a solo exhibition versus a small group show, which we'd call in 2 to 5 people, or a large group show, which is 6 or more people, did you receive any form of payment? So we see that in solo exhibitions, it goes up dramatically, which seems logical, I suppose. Although it'd be nice if it was even across the board. And then it sort of decreases exponentially going to larger group shows.
So the more people that are in the exhibition, the less likely you are to get paid, is the conclusion.
Or get any form of payment.
Get it from.
So these are all conclusions about any form of payment. So after any form of payment, we broke down what are the forms of payment that go into producing an exhibition. How much of the cost of shipping, transporting the work was paid for by the organization. So we have totals here, which is a culmination of the stats that are broken down on the right. So in general, you've got 47, almost 50% covering the cost of shipping. And relatively medium, why is that 22, why is that partial so high? What the hell's going on there?
The artwork needs a correction.
Did that come off on
Well,
this one too? God
It's
damn it.
okay.
You know, there's been like 9,000 hours of
Shading things.
shading things inaccurately, apparently. So we're all artists, and you can imagine that that 29% would actually be higher than that 22%. Or is this
Imagine you're an
creative?
artist.
This is where the survey gets really creative. So in general, and we see the same kind of breakdown where you're more likely, well, what's interesting here is you're actually almost as likely to get full pay or full coverage of your shipping as in a large group show as you are a solo show, interestingly enough. So, and I think one thing that you find as you go through these statistics is they seem really erratic, actually. And the biggest thing that comes out of that is that there is an ability to pay for things, and when and why are things being paid for becomes a real question after looking at the stats, because it's like, so it's possible, it happens. It happens usually less than 50% of the time. Yeah, but no pay. Yeah, again, we have, what is with the bars? The bars are the wrong size. What did that happen? Right there, 14% is higher than 35%. You know,
It's about the numbers, right?
yeah.
Aisha's fired from the next survey graphics job.
Yeah. Once you start paying me, then you can fire me. Okay, so this is installation fees, or not fees, I'm sorry. This is, did your,
Coverage of installation expenses.
right. So this, for us, included like production of work and things like that. Again, I don't know that there's anything super strong to draw out of that one. Full pay still happening about 50% of the time. Okay, travel expenses.
How do you make it clear to people about including production costs as well in the question? Could it just say installation expenses rather than production costs?
How much of your installation expenses covered?
Yeah, it didn't,
It didn't specify that.
yeah, it didn't specify that. I mean, that's, yeah, that's.
You said that you intended production costs to be included in this, and it's not made clear from the question.
Well, it's not, I don't think it was intended to include
I
production expenses. It was
actually
actually,
thought
it was
that, sorry.
installation expenses like, I suppose, lighting, you know, any
Sure.
extraneous expenses that you would incur. But it didn't, it wasn't intended, even though.
Yeah, sure,
in
it's not
retrospect-
meant for commissions. It was not that kind of thing, I'm sorry.
But in
That was a
retrospect,
misnomer.
it would actually be, have been interesting to include that. We should have.
Again, we are artists doing a survey, and that's no excuse. That's no excuse.
No, how the question read in the survey, and we also, I think we're gonna post the survey questions online too.
That's.
I know that's the question. The questions were about the an exhibition itself, so it wasn't about production inside or outside of the studio. It was more about
Production that happens at
production that happened during an exhibition
installation.
installation.
So travel is where we see the highest in the no pay totals. Interestingly enough.
Just one thing.
Uh-huh.
Could it also be that maybe the other 520 people were just living in New York? And there was no, you know, like if they did.
No, so if you travel to New York City
From
from
our town.
town.
Yeah.
So maybe the survey covered only 520 people that lived in.
No.
500.
If you look there, it says 54 respondents.
Yeah.
So this is actually only 54 people
Okay.
actually had to travel to New York City.
No, but there was one of the answers possibly was I did not travel.
Except, that's what.
Yeah, so you had to say, did you travel or did you not travel? And if you said, yes, I traveled, then we would ask you this question.
But one thing I think is really important to note about
Which
the,
means it could be only 54 people that did travel.
Yes, it is 54 people
Yeah,
that said they
and
traveled.
in terms of the number of respondents, what's really, to me, what was so interesting about the survey was that we started out with 977 people that started the survey. Of those people, 577 had exhibited in a nonprofit. So that eliminated 400 people who didn't realize that they were taking a survey about this particular subject. And then the question of, did you receive any form of payment is like, you know, after you choose an organization to talk about, that's the next question. So if you did not receive any form of payment, you were basically like, the survey ended for you because there was no more information for you. to
Right, so this
provide.
is less and less people.
Yeah, so the numbers of people dwindled so quickly after that question is asked. And, you know, it's funny because it makes our, you know, there were moments when
Is
These
this
are,
valid?
this is sort of like false data, there's not enough people, but that's actually, the reason there are not a lot of respondents is because people are not receiving any payment
To begin with.
to begin with. So that's, I think, important to note. And we didn't, like Aisha said, we didn't, when there were less than 5 respondents, we worked with a data analyst who encouraged us to not use anything under, she actually suggested nothing under, I think, 9, but that just wasn't feasible. It eliminated too much data that was actually useful, I think, you know. Yes.
I had a question I should have asked in the beginning.
Mhm.
You have this time period, 2005 to 2010, that includes a boom and a bust. Did you think about segregating those 2 periods to see if the mood
Economy
change?
changed things.
The economy affects these things, and I would expect.
We did, in the beginning, we said we didn't actually use the time frame
I heard
to,
that.
yeah, and
Why?
It didn't seem to make a huge difference, I think.
But it took us a long time to develop the survey. Actually, it was a huge amount of back and forth between us to develop the questions. And I think that by the time we did it,
Yeah.
then it was like, oh, we're in a recession. You know what? It wasn't so like, I don't think that it was so relevant to the work that we were developing the survey.
well, there was also the problem of encouraging people to finish the survey. So to get really specific was really one of our concerns. How many statistics we could ask for. That was one we could have, in hindsight, there's actually several things we would have done differently, but that's a really interesting question, especially potentially doing one from 2010 till 2015, for instance.
Well, it's cool that you capture both.
Both periods.
That's right.
Yeah.
Is it travel? Looks like it's the traveling of the specific artists to the transportation expenses from the studio to the nonprofit. That will be inside exhibitions.
That's in shipping, I think. That's a separate.
Wait, where are you?
There's installation.
You're talking about this shipping? Is this the one you're talking about?
Oh, this is no sheet. Okay.
It's a little dark in here, if we can.
Say, you should bring a flashlight.
Nobody wants you to see these statistics, actually.
Okay, so then we have performance, lecture, and screening expenses, which we separated out mostly because exhibitions tend to run for longer periods, a month, potentially longer. Performance, lectures, and screenings tendency to be a one-night events or maybe a couple night events, but and we just felt like it was a different type of practice within the exhibition space. So how much, so this is a question, because lectures and screenings, we made very gross assumptions that they didn't have expenses, material expenses inherently.
With performance, we asked a question about it.
That's what I'm saying. I'm just saying we didn't ask for lecture and screening.
Yeah.
We only asked for performance. So this is specifically for performance expenses. And what you get from that is you get partial pay, no pay, a lot in the same realm as what we saw before. This is for traveling.
Wait, hold on. Just can you go back to that? Because I think that with that one, you're less likely to get your expenses covered from a small to medium organization.
Oh yeah, this is an important thing. You're
A
right.
large one, which is interesting. Like,
Well, yeah, so what you see here is in a large institution, 50% of the time, there was no coverage of expenses for, yeah, that's what we're doing. On the right, 50% of the time, larger institutions paid nothing for performance expenses, whereas small and medium did not pay. I mean, this is in the negative, 18% of the time. So full and partial pay, happening a lot more for a small and medium institution. Which is interesting because then you think, okay, well you have these institutions who have smaller budgets, but they're covering more expenses. And that actually shows up a lot throughout the survey, but go ahead.
You could also argue larger institutions do more lectures and smaller institutions do more performances.
Possibly.
We can say that.
So travel expenses, again, large institutions show up worse than small institutions. And I think, we did solo and group for these ones, okay, yeah. And so this is the next section I'm gonna go into actually. So this is the artist fees. Separate from any shipping, installation, or travel expenses. So this is after you may or may not have had your expenses covered, but if you did have them covered, how much was the artist fee or honorarium you received? In the solo, oh my goodness, that's so low. In the solo and large group exhibitions, getting nothing. I mean, it's really interesting that you receive no. You're more likely to receive no fees in a large group exhibition. This seems sort of more normal. But the interesting thing is, with a solo exhibition, you're almost as likely to get $2,000 to $5,000 as you are to get nothing. Whereas small group shows, there's a pretty heavy medium in there of people getting fees somewhere between $100 and $500. Let's say that 22% and the 20% above it. Oops, that's the wrong direction. Again, so small, and the comparison between small and large organizations seems to be one of the really significant and interesting things that have come out of this, because this is, again, the same breakdown of did you receive an artist fee above and beyond having your expenses covered. That the large organization was less likely to pay you than the small one to get an artist fee. And the artist fee you were most likely to receive in a small institution was somewhere between $100 and $300. Whereas with the largest institution, it's a really strata. The strata is pretty even all the way up, which is quite interesting. Then we did performance, lecture, and screenings, small and large institutions, and then we have this totally amazing bracket that happens where you're almost as likely to get paid a ton of money as you are to get nothing. What does that say about one-off events? And that's it. I think we're going to just move on to the comparison, unless there was something else we wanted to bring up about that.
I don't know, I feel like I'm still absorbing the information. Yeah, do people have questions or thoughts about, yeah?
I'm just curious, like, especially looking at this one, if you have any other data that correlates to some of these statistics to people's wages. You know, like, for instance, I'm wondering if there's like an age-based correlation between like whether you're getting $0 or whether you're getting $5,000.
We have that data, but we have to, it just means, it means cross-referencing it. It means like, actually we do have an analysis by age. Like the survey was analyzed by, I think it was like 500 categories, by institution, by age, by gender, by number of artists who answered each question. And we have that status.
We can dig it out for you.
Yeah.
If that's a request, we'll take it.
No, I'm just betting that that's
That has to do with the bracketing.
That's
I'm right, that would be my guess too, but it would be interesting to prove that. It's true.
Is there some good definition of a small institution and large institution? Yeah, not just large and small.
Yeah, I think when that was we spent a lot of time talking about that, thinking about it. I mean, definitely one thing that collecting organizations like museum collecting institutions were obviously large. There were large organizations and museums, and we weren't able to look at size of operating budget. That's actually like a really major part of how CARPAC is set up, and we're going to talk about that. But we didn't have, yeah, we didn't have access. I mean, I suppose we could have looked at the 990s of all these organizations, but we didn't. And in fact, there was actually one, yeah, a couple of, I think PS1 made it onto both by accident, which is possibly why there were more respondents to PS1, but I don't think so. But it was just, I think it was a kind of a consensus-based process of what we, assumptions that we needed about what was small and what was large.
Well, and also, if you just look at the bottom, that this is an actual list of institutions that were, the way we divided them, which is through this method of general assumption of collecting institution and general size, what we knew. And then people wrote in their own, ideas about what a large organization is, like the public theater being a large organization. So the division is only clear in the sense that you can see actually who's on each list. That's the best way to deal with it. But it was intended to divide pretty much along those lines. Yeah.
So I think it would be helpful before we move on. You guys say that you'd like these statistics to represent visual and performing artists in New York. And I was wondering if you could speak a little more clearly about the specific art worlds that you're talking about, because you're obviously not trying to talk about everybody who ever made a picture in New York. You're talking about people who are trying to exhibit and are exhibiting at a particular sort of nonprofit. So if you could talk a little more about how you tried to get to those people and how well you think you captured them, that would be really helpful, I think.
Well, yeah, so we're distinctly dealing with professional artists, people who consider themselves professional artists, in the sense that they are exhibiting artists, and artists who are only, artists usually are working with galleries, nonprofits, at Sundry, and artist room, pop-up, whatever spaces, a number of things. Wage has always been focused on how nonprofits work, specifically because the gallery system already has an economic system in it. It may be problematic, but that's a whole other beast that maybe Wage can get to someday. But for now, we've essentially started with the parameters that nonprofit organizations get funding from various sources to be educational institutions. And under that premise, the artist is essentially the educator. And we're wondering why the educator isn't paid, or why expenses are not covered, or if they are, and if we're wrong.
Right, I was going to say what we found out from the survey is that people aren't paid. We also found out that they are paid, so that's important about those facts. Both of those sides of it are important. We also know that some artists have exhibited perhaps once, and others have exhibited numerous times. So,
and that's kind of clear if you read. There's a comment section on the other side where people could leave comments in the survey, and you'll see that some people are like, "Well, I've been a professional artist. I've showed at every major institution, blah blah blah." Other people who are referencing things of like working at a much smaller scale. So this covers a very large swath, but certainly a swath that's working with specifically nonprofits.
But did we say before that the survey was distributed through our mailing list, maybe Facebook, I can't remember. But the main thing was when eFlux sent out an announcement for us pro bono, it was like, suddenly there were like hundreds and hundreds more people that started. We just saw a bump up like the day it went out, which was amazing. But I think, I think, that's the constituency that was, in general, that's the constituency.
Did you ask about, how the payment came about, whether the artist asked to be paid,
well, there's a section in the survey that is anecdotal, underneath Bill's drawing. We selected, there was a space for commentary after. I don't know if that answers your question. So that was more of a free-form response to what people's experiences and conditions were regarding this survey and what it brought up for them. So that was optional. But I think that's interesting. And some people referenced that situation. We have lots more.
asked and didn't get, or?
Didn't ask and didn't think
or
about
didn't
it.
think they should have it, didn't think they deserved it.
But we largely, that's most of the, that's why Wage began, was because of those experiences.
I'm just wondering if you guys have found any like trends in looking at the larger institutions versus smaller institutions in this day and age. You know, you have 135 respondents, and I'm wondering if, you know, with smaller institutions, if it's 29% of 100 people said that they got funding, or, you know, just looking at like the comparison, like who's showing with smaller institutions versus larger, coming from, you know, people like us, like FEAST, that kind of started a small organization in this kind of crisis of funding. I'm just wondering if you guys have made any notice of that.
Reframe the question quick, sorry.
I guess I'm just wondering, you know, when we look at 135 respondents here to like getting funding from a large or small organization, did you notice the numbers of people that are getting funding from small organizations versus large? Like, is it 5 people responded that they got funding from a large institution and 130 said they got it from a small? You know what I mean?
So yes, the small, we got a lot more respondents to the small, medium in general.
And it was like 70% to 30%, I think.
Yeah. And in this specific one, actually, we had 100 respondents in the small and 39 for the large. Okay. Yeah.
Just a brief question, was there ever the idea of actually not doing it voluntary, rather than doing, you know, it based on maybe 4 or 5 institutions and ask everybody who participated in their program? Because maybe the motivation of someone with a negative experience with an institution is higher to participate in the survey than for someone who had a positive experience.
Yeah, it's possible. And one of the things that happened in one of our early meetings when the survey idea was being developed was Chelsea. Yeah.
We had a survey working group, actually.
We had someone actually gather of the major institutions, everyone who had shown, so that we could do a direct action or mailing for those people. And this is one of the things that falls apart when you don't, it's like maintaining and staff and the commitment and the time and the a lot of the things that Wage does is based on how much we can do at any given moment, which is part of why we're going nonprofit, because we could pay a staff of people to do exactly that and have a much more targeted and robust survey.
But an exit interview is an important part of any job. So if you're looking at it as labor and the ways that we're framing this discussion, they're still unanswered. You know, what is this that we're talking about? What kind of work is this? Is it work, etc.
There was a thought about reopening the survey and having it open all the time, so that after you have a show, you can just like dump your information into our survey. And we'll have ongoing stats that we can constantly refer back to.
But these forums and discussions are for developing these ideas, how we gather, how we understand our own community with each other, etc.
I think a comment would be a question about, you included performing artists as well as visual artists. And I understand that the market probably thinks of it differently in terms of how you pay for the labor. Because with a visual artist, there's an object that's made, and the labor is transferred to an object that has a commercial value, and you loan it to the institution, you get it back. Whereas with a performance, the labor is in doing the action. You know, the labor is expended. So I think there's a difference in attitude about what you pay for.
Right, I think that's
Do you
actually,
understand my comment?
yeah, I think that's actually why we see something like this, where you see artist fees much more dramatically on the high end for performance, and then exhibiting. I think that there's this idea that the object is, and your presence there is creating cultural capital that's your exchange that will ultimately, you're going to get reimbursed somewhere along the line. So it's, and that's, yeah.
Yeah, and I would also say that there's a lot of nuances to that proposition as well. There's some performers that create objects that then, that's part of their proposition as well, and then, or objects come from that the museum then can actually, or elsewhere can be purchased. I mean, but for the most part, performance is a different animal than visual.
Something I really appreciated was your listing of what people paid for their studios, since that gives a sense of the personal economies of all the people you surveyed. And I wonder if you had any more information about the distribution of people's income, whether they primarily made work exhibiting and performing, whether they primarily made work in the gallery market system, or day jobs, or that would seem to impact, and I'm not sure how, but probably in very interesting ways it would, how people were paid in a nonprofit setting and what they were willing to accept or not accept in a nonprofit setting.
Yes, we thought about it, and this again became one of those moments of what information can we really get to that was focused.
We didn't want to fatigue people with lots of demographic questions before
But I
they
think
got
there's
to
other
this.
surveys.
How many of you have completed a survey, an online survey?
Survey.
For real? And then I could get further into that, how many of you completed, how many of you started. But I know from experience, we tried to bring our own experience into what information we could collect and what the most valuable, pointed questions we could ask and get the most out of. And the furthest we got with people's economic variable, their own personal variables, was we sort of went with the artist studio rent to sort of guide into another part of the survey.
Or this idea that this is like, the extra rent is something that's very specific to art as a profession, let's say. That expense, I mean, there's the MFA expense, there's the number of million expenses, but
that was a pointed way to do it.
Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions before we move on?
We can have more.
Yeah, after we can have other things.
There's more beer,
Yeah.
don't worry.
More beer, more food.
Now we're going to really try hard not to
So,
bore
these
you
are-
into
Right.
submission.
So these are just screenshots of the PDF from the Carfax fee schedule. We only gave a couple because they're not as fun and to look at, but they're really important. The fee schedule is updated annually, and you can get them online in Carfax. So Carfax is a Canadian artist representation. We've talked about it numerous times. It is a fee schedule that's utilized and it's mandated by the legislature and throughout the Canadian territories, that all exhibiting artists must be paid if they're exhibiting with a funded institution. So it's mandated that funders can give, private and public funders can provide monies to institutions for to keep them afloat, but one of the mandates is that they compensate the artists who exhibit there.
But I mean, there are some differences, of course, because in Canada there's very little private funding and it's mostly public. And the other thing to note is that it's a recommended fee schedule, so it's not mandated, which is really important. And I actually just spoke to the director of Carfax at length the other day, and I had to get all of these fee schedules going back to 2005, which is what we're going to talk about now. And it was really interesting to hear that Carfax functions not only because pressure comes down from the funder to the organization, but pressure is coming up from exhibiting artists because they know that they should be getting a fee, and if they're not getting a fee, they can report that to Carfax, and then Carfax will attempt to do something about it. So it sort of functions a little, and it's a bit like kind of a union situation. It's like a union; they have membership,
But it's not a union.
But it's
That's
not
the
a
other
union.
thing.
It's a strange model, and we're using it because it's sort of it works. It's a perfect model for what their fee schedule is really interesting. I feel like economically there's a good kind of corollary between the United States and Canada. We're just really using this as a framework right now. So we're not suggesting that Carfax be the model for wage certification and that it should be the model for our fee schedule that we're developing, but it's a model, and there are a lot of similarities. So right now, I'm going to show you a comparison between using the same timeline as the survey, 2005 to 2010, and look at Artistspace very generously has opened their books to us. And I should say, just full disclosure, I work at Artistspace. I'm a grant writer there, so just to let you know, I already have access to the Yes, and most of it, all her disclaimer. We're gonna show you this comparison chart between what Artistspace paid in fees between 2005 and 2010, but we're also gonna look at 11 and 12 because things have changed a lot since Stefan has arrived, and there's been a real reprioritization of how funding is distributed to artists and what Artistspace chooses to support or not support. So these are the general categories for exhibitions with CARFAC. CARFAC covers a lot of aspects of exhibition, but this is what we're going to focus on right now because this is pretty much what Artistspace focuses on. So again, here, you can just ignore the international category. It's for showing in, I don't even want to get into it actually, but what's important is category 1 and 2. So there's a distinction between, the fee schedule is distributed by size of operating budget. So they're smaller, this is again, this distinction between small to medium organizations potentially and large. So they've had over the years different categories that were much more nuanced, but right now, this is the fee schedule that applies. I think this is the most current one. So it's below 500,000 and above. So Artistspace is in these 5 years always in category 1. Sorry, category 2. Okay, so these, we've removed all the names of shows and names of exhibiting artists and have just given a range. So when it says, for example, solo project with 6 in brackets, it just means that year Artistspace did 6 solo projects and like 2 single work exhibitions. Where there's no bracketing, it just means there was one of those shows. And in blue is the range of fees that were paid, and then of course under red is what CARFAC recommended for that particular year. And sometimes it's close, and sometimes it's not. Like for example, for Solo Project 6, it was always $200. Every artist got paid $200. CARFAC recommended as an artist fee. This is just artist fees, and it should be noted that in these figures, like we didn't pull production costs, like if Artistspace covered production expenses, we didn't pull that. And I also want to note that Artistspace paid curatorial fees and programming fees. But again, we didn't include them because we don't have CARFAC. Also, because we're talking about artist fees, not those other things. Although curatorial fees are something that we want to develop as part of this project. So for example, where it says that 1% of the budget in 2005 was spent on artist fees, if you add in curatorial fees and programming fees, it definitely takes it up, but it would not go over 2%, for sure. I mean, I could, for 2005, it would take it up to $10,000 that was paid in fees in general. So I feel like these numbers are kind of in line with what we found out in the survey, especially for group exhibitions, I think. Although we haven't done, I haven't sat down and compared them super closely.
And I just have to say that this is a really unique experience to be able to see these numbers because we haven't been able to see these numbers and actually look at the numbers ourselves as artists or an advocacy group. It's not that other people haven't looked at this necessarily, been interested in this, or otherwise in the U.S., but it's a new conversation regarding what's been happening for a very small amount of time, which is 5 years. So for us to have access to this is really unique for us, as we felt as Wage.
This might also answer your question about only specifically to Artistspace, but has there been a change pre and post recession?
Yeah,
which interestingly there has, but not in the way you would think.
And actually CARFAC's fee schedule has gone up and down. There was a period where fees went down and then went back up again. So that you can take that into account. But I mean, you can definitely see that what Carfax is recommending is much more than what is actually happening. But there are different reasons for this. I think this is the thing about the survey. In some ways, the survey is really inconclusive. We do know that people are not getting paid, but we know that they are getting paid. And I think this opportunity with Artist Space is to understand why that is and how and with whom potentially that's happening or not happening. Yes?
And I don't mean to sound defensive by any means, but looking at the statistic of the self-answered survey where it says that I think it was something like 77% of artists who showed Artist Space received no compensation, then looking through and seeing, like, if that was a 25-person show, our books show that we paid 25 people a fee. Clearly, we paid more than 70, or more than 25% of the people that, I just wanted to illustrate that.
Yeah, that's an important point, but what we did find in going through, thank you, I forgot to mention this. When we went through year by year looking at each show, like I've said, we've removed the names of the shows, we found that not all the shows that were exhibited at Artist Space were included in payment. So we know that, exactly. So when I first started looking at the fees and I had seen the results of the survey, I thought, oh my God, our survey is wrong. Like clearly Artist Space is paying fees, but there is inconsistency within the budget for sure. And we talked about why that could be. It could be that Artist Space covered expenses and therefore didn't pay a fee. So there are a lot of things that we don't know, and that's what we're really interested in hearing from Stefan and Richard about. Well, we can only really talk about what's going on now, but we all can talk about what's gone on in the past. I want to. So again, there's some kind of weird anomalies. Like in this case of the solo project, this artist chose to, I think this was a piece about labor, so chose to farm out the work and the fees to other people. But I think what you definitely see is that large group shows, people get paid less, and that definitely, we saw that in the survey, that was very clear. Here was a case where, I thought I would leave in that performa. Those were performa works, and Artist Space paid the fees for that. I don't know what that means. And then there was this other case where Campari sponsored a certain number of projects per year. Stephanie, is that right? Campari was a sponsor on some particular projects. And so this artist got $5,000, which was, more than twice what Carfax would recommend. Great. So, I don't know. I don't want to belabor this because it's not. I think you get the idea. But of course, things really start to change. Things change in 2010. This is when Stefan arrives, and there was a period where the space was being renovated. There was one. I think the last programming before Stefan got there was this 8-person show. So you see the fees are in line with what there had been in previous years. And then I put not applicable because Carfax didn't have minimum fees for speaking and lecture. And then, this becomes a really important point because discursive programming is a really important part of what Artist Space does now. And so you'd have much higher programming fees in that year. And I should probably note that. So there's another $12,000 on top of this total fees paid that went into other kinds of production. So then...
Just as a brief, in terms of statistics, if you, for example, have a year with 2 exhibitions of dead artists, you still count them as exhibitions, but it doesn't show up statistically.
Yeah, there's no fee paid to a dead artist.
And no, but that happened in that financial year, for example. Yeah. And the same in terms of production, the increase the overall turnover of investment into artist production quite drastically, but yet in some scenarios went over budget and artists contributed their fees that were promised prior production to the production of the exhibition. Or you have an artist who is 70 and is asthmatic and only flies business class, but you say, therefore, you don't have to pay me a fee.
Right.
So,
Yeah, we get to, you can see that here. So we have, this is the budget for a show which will remain nameless in FY11. And you can see that the total expense that Artist Space put into this project is almost $46,000 for one exhibition. There's a line item for artist fees, and it's blank because this particular artist chose, as Stefan said, to reinvest that fee into more production costs. Or, yeah, I think it was into production costs. But yeah, it could have been for costs. But, so this is like a huge change, and as Stefan pointed out, you wouldn't see this. If you were looking at this, you would not see this. But on the other hand, I don't think that was happening at this point. So, I don't think that Artist Space was putting a huge amount of money into production prior to your arrival. Yeah. But it started now, and this is really important. I mean, this is like partly why we're here to talk about this. So again, this is an exhibition from this fiscal year. Same thing. So $48,000 in expenses. Now, I wanted to include this. I don't know if you can't really see it. Can you guys see that line item? It's probably not very clear. This is like a blank template of an Artist Space operating budget. And the reason I included this was because to illustrate that there's no line item for artist fees. You can't, in looking at this, you can't see if Artist Space did or didn't pay anything. And it actually is in exhibition production costs. And I'm just using this to illustrate this is a problem like all around with the way that budgets are structured. That's what's so easily, what's that word? Invisible. Yeah, this would be so easy to fix. I mean, we don't even know who invented budgets and who invented the way budgets are structured. But all you would need to do is just put a line item in there for artist fees. And this is, I think, this is almost like part of our advocacy. I feel like, at least it's my nerdy advocacy. And but I mean, there are like, budgets that are broken out within the larger budget, like what you see here. This is a project budget. But you don't see that when an organization submits an application to a funder. There's no requirement to show that they're paying artist fees, and that's part of the problem. So,
what show was the sample budget from?
well, we chose not to. Do you want it? It's up to you. Oh, sorry. Oh, the other one. Yeah, that did have a fee. No, that's right. I'm sorry. Wait. Yeah, that was a huge budget, and there was an artist fee on top of it. And this, I think this is kind of exemplary practice, actually.
That was a Hilary Lloyd exhibition.
Another one was Young Bull.
Yeah. So much for anonymity.
I have a question that's both for Wage and for Artist Space, and it actually comes out of my own practice and my own experience being very, very happy to get production costs covered, right? I think all of us have been happy to get a trip paid for, to get a work shift, to get the installation done for us. And in thinking about the distinction between a fee or a wage or a salary and getting production costs covered, it occurred to me that our own sort of sense of like, it's just so great. I'm so lucky to be able to realize my vision. If by participating in that, by always putting our fees back into installation costs, into production costs, into being able to make a bigger work, if we aren't somehow reinforcing this belief that we're all just very privileged to be able to make work and realize our ideas. And so I talked to you today about the exhibition that's up, which is so beautiful, right? And you guys covered all the costs of that production, right? You built the walls, you shipped the work, and that's amazing. And then it can be very difficult to talk about these little fees when we see them spending $46,000 to produce a show. And so I was wondering if you have any ideas about what it means to cover production costs and not salaries or fees or wages or however you want to talk about it, and what you guys think moving forward into a potential certification system, how you're going to deal with things like an organization like Artist Space taking on the burden of a production cost.
Just to be clear, though, Artist Space pays fees on top of production.
Yeah.
This one you're looking at is a bit of an exception. It was a very
complicated situation with the artist who wanted to go above and beyond his production budget that we set forth and was willing to donate his fee. He also had complicated visa payment issues involved in that as well. So this is an exception to the rule we have been working under since. Hillary Lloyd's, that shows a $2,000 fee, that is a much more accurate picture of our operations currently. I just wanted to say that. So Richard could definitely speak more about Mexicali, but we also, for the past 3 years, I feel confident saying artists that we have shown have no out-of-pocket costs. We pay for the production of their work and the exhibition of their work completely.
I guess just before you answer, just the one thing to point out, obviously, this means that fewer artists are going to be having shows every year. And that's an issue that came up in it means, well, because more of the budget is being put into the shows of fewer artists, it means that fewer artists, if sort of, I mean, if this is the model that going forward other organizations adopt, or this does relate to our certification project, it just means the costs are higher for organizations, it means that they might have to pull back on the number of people they can give fees to. Or something else, yeah, but that's potentially...
But Artist Space was paying, the fees may have not matched CARFAC in all the previous years when they were doing larger group shows, but they were paying some kind of artist fee.
But they're not, I mean, yeah, I guess the question is, are those fees high enough?
Well, so that's one question, is are the fees high? What is the standard? What's the minimum you can ask for that allows an institution to function in either way? Because the other thing is, I don't think Wage has any interest in producing a document that would, impose a kind of necessity to change programming, per se. It's more what's going on in your budgets. Like,
that's how much it costs. So, I mean, that's like the dilemma with like the whole system, is that nonprofits are put in this position and they constantly have to do more to impress funders, but they don't get more budgets. So, but I mean, that's what it costs. So people should be doing less, actually, because doing less means that we're more visible. We're like, the situation that we're in is more dire. I think, like, let's show the fact that we don't have resources. Like, that's the problem, is that we keep, this system of exploitation exists because people keep doing more and people don't get paid.
Yeah, that cost is passed on to artists, yeah.
Right, but you could divide a $48,000 budget amongst 5 people or 1 person, and you would have to manage that very differently in the size of projects that you could accommodate.
I would say, Richard.
Sorry, I just want to say that maybe it hasn't been made clear that in the period that we're looking at, the overall operating costs of the organisation rose significantly. And I think that's kind of interesting to look at the fact that, in a way, the kind of amount of funds coming into the organisation has increased in the last 2 years, and that's perhaps reflected in people's confidence in the organisation, perhaps marries with that, and it also, I think, it has a lot to do with the feeling that we're supporting artists in certain ways, and people respond to that, and therefore people feel that their money is going kind of, there's less steps involved until it gets to artists to support them. So that aids in the funding of the organisation.
I mean, I'll say that Artist Space, and this is something Lise brought up when we started working with Artist Space, was that it was started as a project of NISCA. It wasn't started by artists. It wasn't a space that artists created for artists. It was a space that was supposed to be about experimenting and programming to the benefit of artists.
Providing direct support. Actually, the founder was here, Irving Sandler was here. I think he left. He was the co-founder.
Maybe it was probably boring. Right, so that's amazing, I didn't know that. So that's a really interesting part of the history, is how does one define what the mandate of a space actually is, and that would also determine how a budget is spent, and that's also part of our conversation.
Can I ask, just, this relates to wage certification as a kind of mission, if you like. In terms of setting the kind of notion of standardizing a fee schedule, how does that kind of respond to the idea that an organization has a very particular set of economic situations around its programming priorities, and things that, for instance, CARFAC can't doesn't kind of engage with in relation to, for instance, the amount of funds we put towards programming, for instance, as an example, and other organisations do, isn't kind of held within that fee schedule. So my concern with certification as an idea is how can it be nuanced enough to not end up kind of creating issues with how organisations program and work.
Maybe there's a way to build production costs into like in a kind of interrelationship with fees. I don't know. I mean, I think that's again, like I don't think we didn't talk too much about the research partnership, but I feel like one of the really valuable things about it is that we can actually have this conversation and these kinds of questions can be brought up to us.
But what do you imagine certification be, and what form do you imagine it taking as a starting point for that?
That it would be, I think we've imagined that it would be a minimum fee schedule, and I think that part of what we want to do is expand on, Parfact does deal with art in, I think, maybe not a contemporary enough way, and that practices are diverse in the sense that there's social practices and performative, and a line between a performance and a lecture and collaborative is another thing that's not really dealt with. So I think one thing is how do you expand those categories potentially, rather than like doing like a kind of lump, did you meet the fee for this kind of lump category? But this is a problem with categorizing.
It's a problem with institutionalizing artwork.
Yeah, that's true.
So if you start from the very beginning, do we have an agreement between us? Does the artist and the institution have an agreement of some sort, and what that agreement is? I guess I would answer, I mean, we could all answer, and we should probably break for maybe so we can get into the discussion of this very question, it has to reflect a flexibility and a sense of autonomy, which has been the issues that come up within the artist community itself mostly. And it has to reflect a form of consciousness of the directors and administrators at the institution itself. So it's a partnership agreement. And so you think of your workforce as the people that show at your institution. And how do you think about those people as a workforce?
I want to like throw the question back at you. And what do you think artist fees, how do they relate to production costs for you? Do you think that they're superfluous on top of all of this money you're paid to produce work? I mean, we've also talked about this issue of like, once you've paid for, it's just like a commissioning program, once you've paid for the production of all this artwork, then if an artist, this is the other issue, is that some artists that show at Artist Space also have commercial representation, so if that artwork that you paid to produce gets sold through a commercial gallery, Artist Space doesn't see the benefit of that. So there's ways in which, that
abuse happens on two fronts.
Yes, on both fronts. But just like, do you think that the artist fee is superfluous once you're spending this much money on production?
No, I think that the way that we kind of work is that there should be all aspects covered. That an artist shouldn't be out of pocket in any way, but there should also be kind of fee payment for their work, essentially. So it's not one or the other.
And that's where it becomes cloudy, because then you're talking about financial gain, which everyone needs. So it's hard to distinguish between investment, speculation, and gain. And that's where a lot of Stefan's questions come in, even about these survey questions. How do you define these categories of financial compensation? It's a tricky language. And there's so many nuances to producing unique experiences, unique artworks, as opposed to other types of production. So that's difficult. But we think it's a practical discussion. We think it's actually we think there are answers. We're just not exactly sure how to frame them in terms of what we hope the goals are, the ultimate goals are with you guys.
So you you talked a little bit about what you would like in a fee schedule, right? It's a minimum fee schedule and perhaps a little more contemporary or malleable than the one that CARFAC is using. And I was wondering if one of you could talk about what you see as an enforcement mechanism, how you plan to get anyone on board with this, and then maybe after you do that, if somebody from an institution here could say whether that's going to break their institution. Like, I would like to know how feasible this is going forward.
Yeah, I can speak to that funder question. Or do you?
Yeah. Well, this is to add the question for artist spaces. I do wonder, I mean, you're not doing these group shows, but I don't imagine you might not do a group show again at some point. The fees that are set out by CARFAC, would they break the bank inherently? Okay.
That was enough.
That was a no. Anyways, we can enforce it.
Yeah, enforcement. I think the most obvious form of enforcement would be coming from the funder side. And I think what's interesting about this idea of self-regulation in terms of organizations self-regulating, which is the premise of wage certification, that an organization chooses to operate ethically in relation to artists, is that actually extends, there's a sort of corollary in funding structures in terms of most of the funding. I would say, I mean, I don't know if this is true of artist space, but I think it's probably true across the board, that most of the funding comes from private foundations and not from government support anymore, because we just don't have that anymore. So that means that the only way that you can regulate artist fees coming from, like in terms of state regulation, would be enforcement from the government upon itself. The government couldn't regulate private foundations, I don't think. So that self-regulation could also occur within private foundations, and I think that's already happening. I think we do see an interest from private foundations in wanting to support to support artists more directly. So I've been on the, I just always speak from personal experience on this because it was so enlightening. I'm a panelist for NISCA, which is the New York State Council on the Arts, which you probably all know, but they provide funding for pretty much every arts organization in the city. And in the first year I did it for electronic media, film, and visual arts. So I read 190 proposals in like 2 months. It was insane. And 100% of the time, they said they were paid. Every organization said they were paying artist fees, because that's a question that NISCA asks. So it was amazing to get this survey result. So we know that that's actually not true. So during panel, I kept on saying, like as a regional leader, I kept on saying, like, why can't we make people prove that they paid fees? It would be so simple. It would be a matter of showing canceled checks. And they seemed to think it was totally viable to do that. So I think that there's a way, but it's funny because that exploring this is actually sort of like separate from wage certification. Wage certification is wage in relation to the organization, not in relation to funders. But I think we're interested in getting funders to talk to each other and to wage about this, how it could work.
And institutional directors.
And institutional directors. To speak amongst themselves.
No, with us.
Or even that number, like percentage of the annual budget paid out to artists, if that was all transparent and all organizations showed that, that would be like an element.
Exactly. Well, that's the issue of the line item in the budget. So that it would be very clear. You're right. Like in addition to showing canceled checks or some form of proof that fees.
But it's a line item, and that's the most crucial. Those two aspects are sort of crucial. The line item being the most crucial, I think.
I sit on a few boards, and I also raise money and all that. My experience is that there's usually a budget for exhibitions. If it's an organization that has exhibitions, and the budget would be 20,000 times 6 a year. I don't know what it is. And it's, what do you think about leaving how that's spent to the discretion of the artist? And some artists would love to take half the money as an honorarium and pay their private costs, which could be fine. Others want to use it for putting it into the artwork or making a publication. What about making it discretionary to the artist?
Well, I think you can. Ultimately, it would be it's a matter of an institution proving that they're covering costs for the exhibition, and they're covering an artist fee. What happens beyond that? At the end of the day, wage is not going to be able to control that, and I think the important thing is that, and that agency should just exist, but I think that the problem that occurs right now is that it's incredibly inconsistent. Some things are getting completely covered, some people are getting nothing, some people are getting pieces and parts of or you're getting one fee and you're expected to, and usually it's a nominal fee that's not really about covering expenses. No one's asking you, does this really cost this much to do? It's like, here's the thing you're gonna get, make do, which usually means, it's rare that, in my experience, it's rare that you actually get a
Right, well, I would
top of that.
Okay, but I would compare it to, for instance, you know you're producing a brochure, you know you're paying a fee, you know the print, you ask the designer, how much is the printing going to cost? They give you an honest answer. With an art project or artwork or collaborative work, it's a lot more convoluted, it's a lot more complicated. For instance, you overrun costs, then what do? Do you give an extreme budget and then go, pare it down? I think what we're interested, well, at least I can say, speaking from our experience, from our experience trying to have these discussions, we need to figure out how to make sure that people are being compensated in a way that there's a negotiation involved, that it has to be flexible, that the flexibility may not apply to each project, but that this idea of self-regulation also applies to the artist. The artist has to be knowledgeable about these negotiations, and we're also trying to develop materials through this partnership that will be written materials based on a lot of the things that we've learned through this. But that's the nuanced question: is how do you make a budget as an artist, and how do you make sure you're not losing money, and how do you make sure that if there's an instance of negotiation that sometimes it's ongoing, sometimes it's not, depending on the project.
But that's also a question for artist space, I think. And how do you make these budgets? And how do you? You may not, are not obligated to talk about it. Maybe too personal, but
I think there's an important point to make that there's a lot of kind of situations in which a budget such as this is structured so in such a way is kind of very difficult to stick to, because you have to, rob Peter to pay Paul. You have to move things around so much in order to stick within a certain budget. As people are familiar with and trained on making budgets, but I think that there is an interesting thing when thinking about how much you kind of discuss the overall exhibition budget with an artist, because there's all these additional costs within the organisation of an exhibition that are sometimes not that easy to be clear about, as in, why that certain amount of money has to kind of go to that kind of area. So there's a kind of issue there, I suppose, about how much that conversation is an open conversation with an artist.
Well, and also how much flexibility an institution's budget has. The most common thing we've heard, which spurred the survey, was, sorry, we don't have anything. But when you look at it, when you know that this exists in comparison to that conversation, you have to know that every budget has flexibility. So, there's been extreme cases, like the case of MoCA, Mass MoCA, with his name's work, who went $3 million over budget or whatever that was. And then you have cases where you go $2,000 over budget, and then you have cases, So what are we talking about? Who are we talking about? Who are we talking about that with? Those conversations have to be understood, and also budgets have to be flexible. There's just no way to negotiate artist fees without understanding a sense of flexibility about this profession, about this vocation.
But just one more thing to add about that, which is why I was talking about the kind of idea of flexibility and how economy works for an institution is institutional practice, and how an institution kind of structures itself as a practice in the same way as an artist might do, in terms of how it positions itself and the certain things it does in order to position itself. And that's a push and pull as well with working with an artist, is how that relationship works.
I think somebody had their hand up back there.
Okay. I think one of the things that's most exciting about nonprofit art spaces in New York is the plethora of models and the specificity of models. So it's really interesting to look at all of these details for an institution that actually functions in a manner that puts work on exhibit, and even in a manner that's similar to a for-profit gallery. And so I wonder, I think there's a lot of nonprofits that would like to opt in to something like this, but can't fit themselves into either these line items or this sort of. And I'm wondering how we can figure out ways to make standardizations for these incredibly nuanced models that exist here.
Well, Allison, Allison also being a director of a nonprofit. Can I say that? I called you out.
One that's very invested in ways.
Well, yeah, and you, but it's, you're at the baby stages, right? You're, what are you, year 3? I know that you guys, having worked with you, you give as much as you can give, and it's not really possible for you to give an artist fee potentially at this stage. You also have funding limits when you're in the early stages of
an artist fee.
Well, right, but it's you
in addition to production costs.
To the production
that's
costs.
new this year.
Right. Well, congratulations! Yay!
I like that you smile.
But that's part of the big steps of growing as an institution for you. Or you've made that a goal and you've actually accomplished that, which is really exciting to hear. And so, but that, I think that's why this thing has to be based on, we showed you that CARPAC has 2 categories. The idea potentially to have more than 2 categories. But if you have a smaller operating budget, the demands to pay fees should be, proportional or reflective of a smaller budget. So.
But beyond just like our specific model or where we're at, I think I speak for a couple of people that really want to be part of this and to help and to work towards standardization for something as nuanced as the models that are at play in New York is really hard, and I'm wondering if you guys have ideas about creating various either categories or committees, or what is the strategy?
Well, I think that's what we're here to talk about. I don't think that we want to impose something on the communities. I think we want input. I really don't think that we can decide that. But I think we have this idea of a best practices model in addition to the fee schedule, and I mean maybe there's a way of paying in ethics. I don't know.
Do you want to be part of a think tank, Allison?
Yeah, that's one of the reasons we have this partnership is because oftentimes it's tenuous in our meetings. We've had lots of laughs and lots of good times. And oftentimes we hit points where we don't know what we're exactly saying to each other. And once it's spoken, we have to figure out what it means. You see it here even with how we're trying to analyze this data. I mean, and that carries over into the conversations that we have regarding even our fee as an advocacy group. Is this an art project? How is Artspace defining that? That was a huge part of our negotiation with each other. Are we on equal terms? Are we both, organizations? So that flexibility that I think I was trying to bring into the idea of even how an artist budget works has to be also carried over into our practice. We're not talking about easy answers. We're talking about, and I think that's why we're interested in regulation with organizations who want to participate in our program. And we think that will expand because there's a consortium of how many nonprofits speaking with each other? 7 nonprofits that we hope to, that on their own were interested in speaking to us about how they can work together with us to make this more of a model amongst themselves with our concerns as well. And so there's no answers, I guess.
It's being developed. And we, I mean, this is the other thing, is we're looking for ideas and problems. Like, if you look at this and you think, how this could never apply in the structure of what I'm doing, then I'm curious what would apply to your space or your experiences, you know what I mean?
I'm just wondering what the frequency is of having written contracts with particular artists, because I noticed in the comments, for example, there are a lot of complaints about work getting damaged and not being compensated. There are complaints about, I mean, if you have a written contract that's spelled out, you know, this is the institution's responsibility, this is the artist's responsibility. So it's all clear, whatever it is. I mean, and there's also, you know, work getting not returned, things like that. You know, what's getting paid, what's not getting paid for. And, you know, there seems to be a kind of aversion to having that kind of.
Well, that's one of the things we want to roll out of this is downloadable contracts, kind of standard contract, or an idea of a standard contract that could be used in conjunction with a fee schedule. So I think that's really key to all of this. We didn't survey people about that. I don't know. I wouldn't want to speculate, but if it's anything like this, maybe 40% of the time. I mean, I know Artspace, you guys produce contracts, and it's great.
I think we have letters of agreement in most situations, but they're quite informal. They're not lengthy legal contracts.
I understand that wage was done on a certified exhibition before, or at least free, and the museum was wage certified. I wonder if you could talk about how you determine the structure for that and what your experience was. Did it work? Did it feel right?
Well, at that phase, that was sort of the first experiment, because this has been a proposition, and then now with Artspace, it's a proposition being activated. So Lauren Cornell came to us and asked us to be in the show, and Wage said, well, we're not artists, we're an activist group, so we don't make art, we can't be in a show, but we'd be happy to, you know, follow through on an idea that we've had that we'd like to activate. So we said we'll certify the show if you'll pay artist fees, and we did not give a standard because we don't have a standard yet, which is what we're now doing with Artspace, which is a more legitimate version of that. So that was,
we decided
she produced a budget for us that proved that all the artists' expenses were covered and that they all received a fee.
Well, but I think, and most people know about, I think most people know a little bit about that, but if not, the other thing that came out of it that was important was we decided not to certify exhibitions. We didn't think that that was actually productive enough to pursue. So we chose to frame that certification around an institution would have to adhere to certain best practices, standards regarding artist fee payments of some sort.
And also to show a commitment, to, like a long-term commitment to paying fees. If you just pay fees for one exhibition, it doesn't really signify much beyond that. So that's why we're talking about institutional.
Yeah, and the failure of that negotiation was that part of it. The institution didn't want to talk to us directly after Lauren produced the show. They didn't want to speak to us directly about this topic. So that was also one way that spurred our thoughts about how best to work and how we can manifest these ethical standards for this particular relationship. Because there's a lot of relationships that artists have with each other, with institutions that we're not talking about, with other types of institutions. And So we thought how from that experience we could extract one mode of moving forward with producing some sort of effect. The thing that they wouldn't do is speak to us directly, and they wouldn't make their budget public, for instance, that kind of thing. There's several documents that we now have shown just, randomly tonight.
I'll just quickly follow up that I work at the New Museum, which is not why I brought it up, just interested in that thing. But I will say, every budget I've ever done has been so messy that I have been mostly embarrassed to show it to like accounting, except for the bottom line, let alone share it publicly. So I don't think that's why I'm not being shared, and I will say I also don't think it would break the New Museum to build artist fees all over. I really don't think it would. I think it's just a thing. It's like a culture change.
Yeah, out of that was $125,000. There was $2,500 in fees, artist fees for that show.
Yeah.
And also the other thing was that one of Lauren's concerns was not showing the budget. One of her own concerns was that the production expenses would make people's understanding of the budget really skewed. For instance, there would be a certain artist who got $5,000 for their expenses, and that would make other artists upset, like why that $5,000, for instance. So there's a lot of problems within artists understanding each other and also the work, and then in terms of how each person negotiates. I was just speaking, I know Jim would be okay with this. Jim Drain a piece that was purchased by Jeffrey Deitch is now being shown in a show that Mercedes is renting MoCA right now in LA. So Jim went to the producers. It's a production company now, it's not curators. So this is really complicated, and he said, I need an artist fee. He talked to the other artists in the show, and none of them had asked for that. And this is for a car company. This is not a show that's curated by MoCA. It's a promotional event for a car. So if you understand how these budgets are done, whether it's highly commercialized or even essentially a commercial versus a curated show, the standards are the same, unfortunately. So that tells me that, and this is my own conclusion, but that no one's bank is going to be broken by artist fees. It's just a matter of how they're manifested in how much the artists advocate for this. And Arts and Labor and work at New York Union Group, there's lots of other tactics to manifest these changes. Ours is just a very small, particular one that we're hoping to understand and expand ourselves with the community.
We exhausted.
I mean, we can hang out and have sandwiches. I don't know if there should be sandwiches, but we can hang out for a bit and talk.
Yeah, we always wanted to do it. We always like to do an open forum. It's not the second time, but if people are interested in staying.
If you have feedback,
yeah,
give it, please.
We'll make a circle of chairs, and if you want to sit down, I'm willing to sit or drink. So thanks to everyone who came.